Welcome to the HIV podcast. Each week we focus on a person, historical event or pop culture moment linked to HIV and explore the story of what actually happened. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Jess, and between us we've been working in the field of HIV for 40 years. Our aim is to get as many people as possible HIV educated.
Welcome to the HIV podcast.
This week we have an amazing guest and I am extremely excited. So excited I've had to do breathing exercises to keep calm. That is actually true. Our guest is the author of A Curious History of Sex, the host of award-nominated podcast Betwixt the Sheets, The History of Sex, Scandal and Society. It's historian Dr. Kate Lister.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on after we sort of semi-stalked you to get you here. I'm so sorry about that. No choice.
I read a lot of the comments on stuff that I post on social media. After doing this for a while, you realise eventually that it just takes one dickhead to derail you for the rest of the day. And I've just left my university job, so I'm kind of transitioning email. So I hadn't picked up on it. So you made the right call to do a TikTok.
Well, I thought so. I thought, do you know what? Like we said in the video, she can always just be like, I'm just going to ignore them. We don't need to reply. So I very much appreciate that you are here and you have chosen to come on and speak to us.
Pleasure.
We love your podcast, obviously. And we're biased towards the episodes that mention HIV, and the AIDS epidemic episode last December was amazing. So lots to discuss there. But one thing I think both Jess and I wanted to pick up on, and it's because we didn't know anything about it, was the lesbian blood sisters of San Diego.
Yeah, the history of HIV is it's unavoidably bleak and dark and very, very troubling, and you can't get away from that. But alongside of that are these pockets of when people really came together. And I guess it's like any crisis, isn't it? It brings out the best and the worst of people. And the lesbian blood sisters, they started in San Diego, and I can't remember the name of the lady who started it because for a historian I have the worst memory for names. Honestly, it's embarrassing. But it was started by a lesbian group who just wanted to do something to help. And it was in the very early stages of the epidemic when treatment involved taking a lot of blood. So one of the things that would happen is to the sufferers is they become anemic very, very quickly, and they needed blood. And this group of women realised that what they could do is they could donate their blood, and they contacted the hospitals and the services, and they managed to arrange it so their blood would be specifically set aside for the AIDS hospitals. And they put flyers up, and it was really moving because the flyers, it just said, "Our boys need our blood." And I just thought that was so just like, wow. And they thought that it was going to be just a few people attending. But the very first drive there was over 200 people. They were queuing down the block. And it became a really big movement of people just trying to come together to do something. The lesbian blood sisters. And there were blood drives all over the States as well, right into the 90s when the first antiviral drugs started to come in.
Oh my gosh, it really took off then.
It did. I suppose it's just a sense of people want to do something to help. And when you're confronted with a catastrophe on that scale, what can you do? It must have been, people must have felt incredibly helpless in the wake of it, you know?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I find it fascinating that they were able to arrange for that blood just to be used for that, because that must have been quite the arrangement in itself to get that agreement in place.
Yeah, absolutely. But that lesbian sphere, they are very organised and persistent. that was part. So they weren't just like donating blood. Anyone can have it. It had to be put aside specifically for the AIDS hospitals and the AIDS wards, which was incredibly impressive.
It wasn't it?
Yeah.
And lesbians don't really feature, do they, in the history of the HIV epidemic? They don't really get the press that I think they deserve.
They don't get the press that they deserve because they were the ones that stepped up. I mean, you have to remember in the very early days of this thing of how unbelievably terrifying it was. It still scares people to this very day, but in the very early days of it, there are multiple recorded instances of doctors, nurses refusing to treat patients with HIV, not wanting to touch them, having them isolated in rooms just completely by themselves, people dying absolutely on their own. Nobody knew what the hell this thing was. And what happened in almost every community, it was the queer community that came together to support each other, and lesbians were right at the heart of that. They were the ones going into the hospitals, nursing the sick, arranging food drives, not just blood drives, but tending to the sick, getting food, resources, trying, and then of course on a much bigger scale, campaigning for research, for proper help, for justice, for the government to do something. They were there right at the heart of it all the way through.
Amazing, isn't it? I think you're absolutely right. It's a very uplifting story. It was a very bleak time, and I'm glad that you featured it and you've talked about it and kind of brought it out into the open.
Yeah, we'd never heard of them, have we?
Wow.
We'd never heard of that at all.
No,
I say wow, but it was a very hidden history. It wasn't known about until a few years when these women were honoured at the San Diego Lombardo Archives. They have been archiving most of HIV history, and they were the ones that put this honour together. But I have a feeling now, when a catastrophe like that hits, it takes a while for people to be willing to talk about it and explore it and archive it, which sounds counterintuitive because how can you not talk about it? It's happening right now, right this very second. But I think that we're now entering a space in the last 10 years or so where historians are willing to look at this now with a slight, I don't want to say it's history because it's still with us, but of what happened in the 80s and the 90s, and they're now more willing to go back and to look at it in much more detail. That seems to be happening. So it's a history that's being reclaimed as we're going along, and I think more and more stories like this are going to come out of what was happening at the time, of who stepped up, of just these little pockets of resistance and small stories. I think you'll be hearing more and more of them.
Because they need to be heard, don't they? We can't just bury it under under the carpet. It happened. And there were some remarkable people.
Yeah. And people for the longest time don't want to talk about it. You know, we interviewed a lady called Flick on Betwixt, who was a nurse at one of the HIV wards, and I could have listened to her forever and ever. Like, she absolutely broke me. I was in tears listening to the story of just like, wow. And all she's doing, and there was a real sense from her of just like, yeah, but that was just what you did. I was a nurse at the time, and it was, but what she was saying was so moving and powerful. Like the description of there being multiple people dying each day and having to be there and having to witness that and try and ease people through that process as best you can. It was such a powerful story to hear.
It really was. And she's talking, isn't she, about going into the mortuary and you know, that wouldn't normally be part of her job. And she's so honest. I loved it. I used to deal with this by going home and having a drink. Perfect.
Yeah. I mean, it must have, we've been through COVID, haven't we? Which is, I don't think that's really comparable to the HIV crisis, but perhaps in that way of something's happening, it's hitting everybody, nobody really knows what the fuck to do. And also you can see the silence afterwards. There's a real sense with COVID now that we're all going, it's fine now, we've fixed it. Everybody crack on. And like nobody wants to talk about it. Like, I've pitched a couple of newspaper article ideas to various editors, and they've all said, we don't want to talk about COVID. It's just, they're just, no, we're not doing that. We are moving the fuck on. So I think that'll be, people just don't want to talk about it. Don't want to talk about it. It's done. It's happened. We have moved on. It's like this weird thing that happened when we were all shopping before putting it back in the shelf.
That is so weird though, because I think there's a lot of trauma in COVID as well. Obviously, absolutely nothing like, you know, what happened in the 80s and the 90s of the AIDS epidemic. But I do think there's a lot of trauma, and we should talk about it. And it was scary, and it's kind of emotional when you think back to it and think someone told us just to stay in our homes. Like,
yeah.
I mean, if we found that traumatic, yes, I can't even imagine how much trauma comes along with everything that all of those people that were involved in the 80s and the 90s, looking after people with HIV, family members, like, that they live with. And we need to hear about it. Like we're saying, it's part of our history. And more we're actually finding younger people who are either positive or just have an interest in saying, I want to know about this. This is important and I need to learn. And And I had absolutely no idea. Like recently on a TikTok, we were talking to Emma Cole, and she was talking about how she doesn't have a pension now because it was expected that she was going to die when she was diagnosed. Yeah. And so she's like, I don't own a house. I don't have any sort of like nest egg to fall back on. I don't have, all of those different things. And someone had commented underneath and said, I'm 27 and I had absolutely no idea this is what happened. And this is what's happening to kind of long-term survivors who are still living with HIV. So yeah, we need to talk about it.
We do. It's interesting when you witness what happens with trauma. And I think perhaps we're all a bit guilty of downplaying COVID, because we're all like, I don't want to compare COVID to HIV. I don't want to compare it. But as you said, that was very, very traumatic. And at the moment, we're in a stage of we don't want to talk about it and properly turn around and face up to the fact that was scary. And there will be stories in years to come about the nurses on the COVID wards who were dealing with people dying every single day. And I remember, like, there was that, the death tally of like, it was 1,000 people every day who were dying, and you were just there, just like, what the hell's going on? But that, if you got COVID, it wasn't necessarily a death sentence, which HIV was. And I think there's a lot of guilt tied up with the HIV crisis historically, because so much stigma was projected onto one group of people, and that hindered research for a very, very long time, because it was much easier to just be like, oh, it's just a thing that affects gay people. And underlying and underplaying that was, well, they kind of brought it on themselves. See that playing out right from the earliest beginnings, right from day dot. So I think that there's a lot of guilt around it as well, in a way that there won't be necessarily with COVID, although perhaps we could, maybe there's some guilt involved in there as well. But it's a difficult history to look at, because people have to reckon with the fact that these people were left to die by themselves. And it's horrendous.
Yeah, I could see, yes, the comparables to COVID, definitely. And that feeling of being very frightened and not really understanding what's going on, and having your whole life changed almost overnight because you now can't go outside. But I just think that affected all of us. HIV just affected this small group. How isolated must they have felt? Because everybody else kind of just went, no, this is your issue.
This is your issue. You did this. Although you could make a case that we did stigmatize older people with COVID. There was that running through it at the same time. It's like, well, it's just old people, isn't it? So I don't know why I have to stay inside.
That's a good point. Yes. Yeah. We'll just put them all in the care homes, and we'll just, Oh my gosh. It's like history repeating itself. The government acting very late.
And if you
don't learn, do they?
I'm afraid they don't. And if you look at the history of pandemics and epidemics as they hit throughout history, that is pretty much textbook. Is they will act too late because nobody wants to actually acknowledge what's happening. Everybody, if you're being generous, you could say they're hoping for the best. If you're not being generous, you're saying that they're in denial. And then it hits, and then people get frightened and someone gets blamed. In the Black Death, the Jews were blamed. They were pretty easy to blame. There was pogroms all over Europe as Jews were hunted down and killed en masse. They were accused of poisoning the waters and all kinds of things like that. There was fear that this was a punishment from God, and that he'd sent this to it was sinners that had done it, and that it's your fault if you've been fornicating and all of this kind of stuff. You've brought the plague down upon us. So whenever there's a catastrophe, there's blame, because that's easier to do, isn't it? Because it gives you a false sense of security if you can find it's them, they did it. And whether that's you're actively saying Jewish people have been putting poison in the waters, which I think was the accusation at York, or whether you're saying, well, it's just gay people who've been having the kind of sex that we strongly disapprove of. Again, it's a blame. It's a way of protecting yourself. But that's textbook, is blame, fear, distancing yourself from the sick all throughout history.
Oh my goodness. And is it because those who are in authority who can make change? I mean, it's a gift for them, isn't it? Because while we're all focusing on who to blame, they don't actually have to take action or deal with it in a proper manner.
Illnesses and pandemics are very difficult to deal with anyway, because it's one of those things where you can't really bring the army in and fix it. It's like, it's a completely different enemy that you're attempting to deal with. Like, what can you actually do about it? The government can mostly attempt to limit contagion, which is what they've done, which is what they did in COVID as well. The very word quarantine comes from the Latin. It means 40 because you would originally be quarantined at sea, where the boats were quarantined for 40 days before they could come in. But yeah, so the government, you'd never want to be in charge when a pandemic hit, because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, really. Yeah. But I can't really think of any examples throughout history where you could go, well done, government, you handled that one magnificently. It was a rough ride for a while there, but you did good. It's always been an absolute shit show. And HIV is absolutely no different at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, during that episode, you spoke to Richard Mackay, who wrote Patient Zero in the Making of the AIDS Epidemic. Again, a good example of where blame is apportioned to one person.
One person.
We've done an episode on this before, and I don't think we've ever got over the shock of understanding that this person was named and shamed for years.
Well, still is. Like,
still is.
Yeah, still is. It's still happening.
It wasn't Richard Mackay that we spoke to. It was the guy who wrote, was his name Richard Mackay? It wasn't the guy who identified Patient Zero. It was the guy who wrote the book to go, hang the fuck on.
Yeah.
Hang on. But the idea that there was a Patient Zero, the idea that there was one person who had done this, it was so easy and convenient to just get angry and blame that one person. And it was so unfair. And that persisted. Like you said, it's still with us to this very day. And that poor guy, what was his name?
Gaetan Dugas.
Yeah.
Yes. I hate calling him Patient Zero. But it was because he was an airline steward, wasn't it? And that he'd travelled around.
So he was Canadian, but had been diagnosed in America when they were doing the initial they were trying to plot how HIV was being spread. And they coded everybody with a different code depending on their area. And then they gave them a number, but he was out of area. So he became sort of 00, or as people took it, 0. And because on the spider chart, or whatever you call it, he was right at the centre, the press assumed that he was the one that brought this to America.
Horrendous. And what is the function of that anyway? Because even if that was right, and it wasn't, but even if that was right, that this was the first person, what good is shouting at him and being rageful and calling him evil and wicked? And he was just the first person to get sick, and it wasn't true anyway. The origins of HIV are very mysterious, of exactly where it came from, what happened, how did it jump the species barrier. It certainly wasn't the fault of one Canadian airline steward.
No. And he was vilified, really, because he kept a diary of who he'd been sleeping with, which he shared with public health over there, or the CDC over there, to help other people.
Yeah.
But because he had quite good records, again, everyone's like, well, it must be you. You must be at the centre of that. And I can't believe it.
If I remember correctly, it was really early. It was like the early 80s. So it's right at the beginning. If I remember correctly, he didn't believe that he was spreading HIV through sex, or it was something like that. And that was picked up on and vilified. But that was incredibly common at the time. And a lot of people thought that they hadn't actually located what was spreading this virus at that point. So the fact that he didn't or wasn't convinced that this was spread by sexual contact, that was picked up again of like, you evil person, as if he was knowingly going and doing it, which wasn't the case at all. This was still in the phase where they were referring to it as the gay cancer.
Yes. Oh goodness. Okay, let's broaden our topic a bit before I start getting really depressed about everybody, the press in particular.
Yeah, that's one of our pet hates, isn't it, Sarah? We spend a lot of time just hating the press generally on this podcast.
you're hating the press and what they do. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
even now, how they report on HIV, like when is it not an extremely shocking headline? And you'll read the actual like bulk of the story and you're like, this has nothing to do with that headline, but it's always how HIV is presented, isn't it? We must make it really shocking. So
It's always
yeah.
catastrophic.
Yeah, we're not big fans. Not big fans.
No, we're not. But equally, we do like to be featured in the press.
They don't like us much.
No.
You must be doing something right then. That's okay.
Yeah, so we kind of want it all, but we also want it to be very clear that we just very much disapprove of anything they report on HIV. One of the things we wanted to note, so we work for an HIV charity. There's lots of sex talk, not just between me and Jess, but with service users. And we often notice the Britishness around how we discuss sex. Because as a nation, we're just not that open, are we? Has that always been the case in history in the UK? Or is this kind of learned behaviour over the years?
This is a leftover thing from the Victorians and their attitudes to sexuality, I think. When we talk about the Victorians, it's very tempting for us to think it was thousands of years ago. Like it's well in the depths of history. It's a different planet, pretty much. But if you think about it, it's like 125 years ago. Like that's 2 65-year-old people back to back ish. It's not in like the scope of human history of how long we've been on this planet. It's that. So we are still living in the legacy of the Victorians and what they did. And they're fascinating. But one of the things that happened in the 19th century, and it had been rumbling for a long time, but with industrialization, the emergence of the middle class expanded. There's always been a middle bit, but in the 19th century, it expanded considerably as people went into professions like shopkeeping, accountancy, bookmaking. It became, the wealth was distributed more. And it has been argued that one thing that came along with that was a renewed moral zeal, primarily from the middle classes, who couldn't better the aristocracy in money terms, but they could be morally better. So what you get is this very kind of imperious, judgy, kind of Hyacinth Bouquet type of character who is going to assert their moral authority because they don't have enough wealth to back it up. And they're certainly going to be better than the plebs at the bottom. And there's something to be said for that, because middle-class morality is a privilege. Like, hear me out, right? If you are a working class person in the 19th century and you're living in a slum in a room with 8 other families and you don't have enough water to wash yourselves, and you do not have the luxury of a morality that says you must be delicate at all times and you must never see each other naked and you must wear buttoned up clothing and not talk about, you can't do that. You don't have the luxury for that. There was no women staying at home and draping themselves over sofas because that was what they were supposed to do. They had to go out and earn money. And the upper classes, well, they didn't have to do that because they're loaded and they'll do whatever the hell they want to do. So the middle class morality becomes like, it sets the temperature for a lot of the conversations around sex in the Victorian period. And a lot of that is repressive. It becomes very pearl clutchy and very like, oh, well, I would never. But it's not the whole story, because they were clearly having a lot of sex. These are the people that invented pornographic film, for God's sake. So it's not that everyone was doing that, but what emerges is this way of judging sex and sexuality through a moral lens of like, oh, well, I would never do that. And that continued, and we're still wrestling with that to this very day. In many ways, we're much better at talking about sex. We can have a podcast like this, and you can go and see films, and people are shagging all over the place. But it's still a very narrow view of sex, often. It's still very heteronormative. They tend to be young and beautiful and able-bodied. You don't tend to get a lot of, or if you do get queer sex, it's definitely in the minority. So we're getting to a point where we're more comfortable, but talking about sex that falls outside of what is effectively heterosexual sex for making babies, gay sex, for example, we're still very about it. Not everybody, but you guys will know this from the work that you do, is it does make people uncomfortable. It does.
Definitely. Oh, I can't believe this goes back to Victorian times, and it's a status thing.
It's a status thing. It's a I mean, there's lots of other stuff going on. There'll be people listening to this who do work on the early modern period going, excuse me, the Protestant Reformation. And they, like, all of these morals and things start to come through. But really what's happening in the 19th century is they've linked sexual morality to moral worth in general, that it's just something that people who can't control themselves, that the lower orders do. And but at the same time, they're fascinated with it. Like, they can't look away. They're not a group of people who don't want to talk about sex. They talk about it obsessively. Like, if I came on this podcast, if I was like, right, has anyone got any bananas? I don't want to know if you've got any bananas. Have you got a banana? Has anyone? I just don't want. Do I sound like a person who has zero problem with bananas? Or do I sound like I might be a little bit hyper-focused? That's the Victorians. Is they were, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe that such and such is getting divorced. Quick, let's have a huge scandal spread on it where we can all judge and we can all be, oh God, I would never. And that's what we're still dealing with today, unpicking it.
We're still seeing those same attitudes. When you said it's that whole thing of not controlling yourself, we've literally just run a free HIV testing campaign in sort of part of the area that we work in. And some of the comments literally said, like, people bothering to take the time to comment, to say things like, using language like animals that can't control themselves and things like that. And you're like, what? It's so funny that you said that, because it's like, we are hearing that in 2024.
Yep. And when it's sex, there's so much judgment and projection that I find is that people will say stuff like that. They'll be like, oh God, could you not even control yourself enough to use a condom? You want to sit down and just go, all right, Kevin, have you used a condom every single time that you've had sex? Every single time? Have you bollocks? Have you bollocks? We've all had, well, she says, I shouldn't say for everyone, but the vast majority of us have had unprotected sex, whether that's a one night stand or a partner or whatever that is. But we're so quick to judge other people. We're so fast. Like, when you get politicians mouthing off about, how horrendous porn is or how horrendous sex work is, it's like, do you want to show us your internet history? Just let us have a quick squiz at what you've been looking at before we leap into this. But I think what it is that you project in order to try and distance yourself.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's how it always feels when people are doing it. I am nothing like that. And let me on Facebook bother to waste my time doing this. Just keep scrolling. Like, just don't worry about it.
You didn't need, like, that took a ridiculous amount of effort to actually sit down and show your ass on the internet for no particular reason at all. But like, it still makes people angry in a really, it's horrendous, but from a psychological point of view, it's also fascinating of like, what was it about the idea of someone having a free HIV test that made you angry for that second, just there, for that made you go, it's so, like, if it was a free COVID test, you wouldn't bat an eyelid. Yeah. If it was a free flu test, no, but it's anything to do with sex. And we're back to this, well, how dare you? Quick, stone the harlot, drag them out. And that we still haven't dismantled that. That is still absolutely with us. You can see that in the stigma that we still have around HIV, but also any STI. People are very, very stigmatized about that. Any kind of sex at all. I do a lot of work on sex worker history, and with sex workers, and they are also blamed for the violence that is projected against them in the same way. It's a very odd thing that we do, but I would say that goes, we've been doing it for a very long time, and it's about trying to show that you are a better person because you can control yourself.
Yes. But such a long time it's been going on. Just from one period in history still has an impact on us today.
We've been judging sex and sex diseases for a very long time. If you think of something about like syphilis, which that evoked everything that we're talking about now, is that people were blamed for contracting the disease itself. Women were blamed for spreading the disease. Obviously, what part would men have had in that? just the women. But that was also very visible on the body and on the face, the effects of syphilis. It attacks the soft tissues, and so the nose will often cave in and lesions will form. So there's no hiding it if your nose has fallen off. And it becomes very judgmental in the same way of like, well, maybe then you just shouldn't have had sex. But you're having sex. We're all, what's this weird thing? And I think, again, it's about protecting yourself. It's like, well, if I judge them, that's not the kind of sex that I'm having, so I'll be fine.
So with syphilis, because has there been one outbreak in history or lots of different outbreaks?
Syphilis its origins are kind of disputed. It was all linked to a Canadian airman in the 16th century. That's not true. Its origin.
You're going to name that person, aren't you?
Name that person, person zero. So there is a theory that it came from the Americas when Christopher Columbus came back, but that is disputed by the fact that there's evidence for syphilis in skeletons going right back to the Middle Ages that people have found. So we're just not sure. But what tends to happen with viral infections or any kind of pandemic is they mutate and they change. Like the virus HIV will have been around for a long time before somehow it mutated, it did something, and then it did something. In the same way, the Black Death. That Black Death is still around today. There are still periodic outbreaks in Africa and in South America, but it doesn't kill a third of the population because it's mutated slightly. So it's not as lethal. Syphilis, we're not sure where it came from, but it absolutely explodes in the 15th and 16th centuries. And it's first recorded in army troops, which is a huge concern from that day right up until now, is venereal disease in the armed forces. And it's not because anyone really cares about soldiers' health. It's because they can't fight if they're sick. And they tend to have a lot of sex when they're out fighting, because if you have to walk into a cannon holding a sword, you might get a blowjob too. So syphilis, and it's a horrendous disease. I think we're often shielded from just how bad syphilis is because it's curable with penicillin. But it's a spirochete that it gets into the bones, into the organs. When you first get it, you'll develop a severe flu-like symptom and you'll get lesions and rashes all over your body. And then it'll go dormant and you'll think you're better. You'll think, oh, that was shit, but that's past. And it can stay dormant for up to 10 years. But in that time, it's attacking the soft tissues, the nervous systems, the skeleton, and then it'll emerge. And it does things like it can cause dementia if it attacks the brain and the nervous system. It attacks soft lesions around the face. You get these like horrible pus-filled disfigure. It's very, very disfiguring. And then it can kill you as well. And it's highly contagious. It's a really fucking nasty disease to get.
Did they know that it was passed through sex?
They did. They figured that one out relatively quickly. But again, it's still tied up with notions of sin, that this is punishment for your sin. But we know that it was linked to sex because this is where evidence of the first condoms comes from, is it was physicians and doctors attempting to find out how you can stop the transmission of venereal disease at the time. So we've got records of that. They wouldn't have done anything. The surgeon who invented the first condom was called Gabriel Falloppio, and it was basically a bandage dipped in oils and alcohol that you wrapped around the penis after sex.
No way.
No sense.
No sense. No, but it made sense to him and he was really, really proud of it. So I don't know how many people had to use that. But eventually they start making animal gut condoms, which can protect against pregnancy, but not against disease.
Right.
So again, pretty grim and
not a great option either, is it?
It's not great, but then if the other option is that your nose might fall off, I guess you'd give it.
Yes, you're right. I would give it a whirl. Absolutely.
Give it a try.
I think everybody's getting a flavour for how good your podcast is, because these are fascinating facts.
They just rattle around my head.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask, or we wanted to ask. How do you come up with the topics that you discuss?
Oh, well, there are multiple routes for that one. Listeners email in and they tend to have really good suggestions. They actually do. They have some real belters. So yeah, cheers. Thanks for that one. Other ones is that it's something that I'm currently researching. So if I'm writing an article, or if I'm doing something like I was asked, even by the Telegraph of all people, to do a thing about the history of the bearded lady, because there's some documentary coming out. And I did it and I was fine, but like I'm not an expert. So, but then I was like, we should do the bearded lady. We should get somebody in. We should get a bearded lady expert. And lo and behold, there they were. So yeah, and then the producers, they have lots of ideas as well. But I don't, sometimes I think, am I going to run out of ideas? I thought, no, sex is pretty exhaustive. There's
Isn't
always
it?
something
There
to
is.
talk about.
One of my favourite episodes is when you're talking about Neanderthals.
I like that one too. She was good, wasn't she?
Amazing. And you were wondering, I just thought, yes, this is where my mind is going too. You were wondering if anyone had ever created a Neanderthal vagina. And the reason you were asking that, and it's a really good question, is because they had a different shaped head. So did the vagina back then adapt to the head shape?
Yes. I think that is a very important question, but it's one of the many questions that I ask that then get played back to me after the fact. So, oh no. Or if I start saying it and then I'm just like, where are you going to go with this one? The one that my mum's never ever let me forget was when I was interviewing a lady who was an expert on Stonewall and what happened to Stonewall Inn and with the gay riots that happened. And she was telling me all about the fact that Stonewall was owned by the mafia. It was a mafia-owned pub. And I said, before I even realised what I'd said, I was like, oh, I didn't realise the mafia were really gay friendly. And she was just like, no, Kate, that's not what was happening. Is the mafia were not supporting gay rights by running the pub. They were exploiting the community.
I love to think that, though. I love that. Well, what a beautiful historical misconception that the mafia were really supportive.
Yeah,
of gay
really
rights.
supportive. They're there with their rainbow flags and and singing along to Diana Ross. No, Kate, that's not what was happening at all. But I love that Neanderthal one. She was fascinating. I love it when you speak to archaeologists, like the people that do science and history, and the stuff that they can work out now. Like they can just like look at a bone and be like, oh yeah, this is a shin bone of a 9-year-old female who was called Rita, and it's just like the Neanderthal vagina. That was because she was saying once that the Neanderthals have a big bulk on the back of their head. Yeah. So that was the vagina a different shape to accommodate that?
Nobody
and surprisingly, nobody's done any research on that one.
No. I was fascinated because it's like, I mean, that's going way, way back in history. That is a technical term. I'm sure you appreciate, Kate.
Yonks ago.
And I have never thought about Neanderthals having sex, but of course they did.
They did. And what surprised me about that one is that because they have a reputation as being, just kind of like brainless lugs, don't they, the Neanderthals? But they were actually very clever. They've existed alongside Homo sapiens longer than they haven't existed alongside of us. We did breed, we did interbreed. And I think the thing that surprised me most about that interview, that I remember most about it, is she said there's strong evidence that we crossbred because genetics, but we've never, ever, ever found a burial site with Homo sapiens and Neanderthals together. So we were shagging each other, but we didn't live with each other.
I remember.
Yes. Just, So I don't know, was it us or was it them that was just like, look, just fuck off, all right? Your Uber's on the way. Just don't hang around, please.
Even back then, it was a divided nation, wasn't it?
It was.
Oh. Do you have a favourite historical sex fact?
Yeah, I have. I was thinking about one for your podcast because I wanted to have a good one for you. And this has been suggested. It hasn't been proven and confirmed. But when you're looking at the origins of HIV, how did that virus cross the species from primates to humans? It has been suggested that leap may have taken place owing to a big craze in the 1920s of gland transplants. Right. So this was right at the beginning of hormone therapy, in that humans had worked out what hormones are, and they worked out that testosterone makes manly stuff happen and estrogen makes womanly stuff happen. But they got very carried away from that point, and somebody, his name was Voronov, Serge Voronov, he was a Russian physician. He thought that if he takes a part of a monkey's testicle, right, and extracts it and grafts it into a human testicle, that will rejuvenate the man's body because it'll be like a boost of testosterone for him. And he became incredibly popular, and this surgery became incredibly popular. And it led to other things like gland extracts being put in things like face creams. And like it was like a proper thing for it. It got so insane that in 1920 in Chicago, 2 men were found drugged outside who had had their testicles cut out and stitched up again. So it must have been by a surgeon who knew what they were doing. But the theory, what they never found who did it, but the theory was that was done to feed this craze for testicle transplant rejuvenation. And because Voronov was doing it with monkeys and hundreds and hundreds of them, it has been suggested that that may well be where HIV made the leap from primates to humans.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's bonkers, isn't it?
It is.
Imagine going out for a night and having to be terrified that someone might steal your bollocks.
Absolutely crazy. It was 2 guys, it might have even been 3, and they were having a drink in a bar, and that's the last thing that they remember. And then they woke up in a doorway, and they eventually went to the hospital. They didn't realize anything was wrong because the person hadn't like taken the testicle sac. It was just what was inside. So they'd slit it open, removed the scrotal sac, and then re-sewn it all. So they hadn't quite realized what had happened. They were just very sore. And it wasn't until they went to hospital that it was discovered what had happened to them. Absolutely wild. It was reported in the press at the time as gland larceny. No, we should have laughed, but that's a good line.
Oh my God. Well, this has completely blown my mind.
I know. There's no, like, it can't be studied now because obviously all these people are long dead and the monkeys never got a say in it anyway. But it has.
They didn't consent then.
They didn't. Yeah, just the whole thing was even worse for them. But it has been suggested that this might be where the species jump happened.
In a million years, you
never
would
think
never
that, would
predict
you?
that. No,
No,
absolutely not.
No, you'd be like, surely we've either eaten them or had sex with them. It's like, no, it's even weirder than that.
Yeah, exactly.
Some Russian doctor was cutting up monkey testicles and stitching them into human testicles because he thought it made them better in bed.
More virile, yeah.
More virile.
To even have that thought process.
There is method in the madness-ish. If you kind of go, right, we understand now that testosterone is a like it will boost you, and that's what makes you full of manly vigor, etc. My friends that are on testosterone replacement for the menopause will attest to the fact that it's pretty good stuff, that it makes you feel woo. But what if you've got that in place? It's not that much of a leap to go, it's made in the testicles. I know. Let's put other testicles inside the testicles. They wanted to do it with humans. They wanted human testicles, but obviously they couldn't get the ethical clearance for that one. See, that because the thing is, they knew a little bit. They knew what testosterone is, and then it all went to hell after that. Someone should have just been saying, "I don't think no. Let's just wait. Let's just do some more research first."
Yeah,
but no, they didn't.
Yeah.
They didn't. They just went for it.
Okay, so he was quite ahead of his time then in his thinking.
That's very generous. He was, and he wasn't the only one. There was lots of people doing lots of very strange stuff in the 1920s because science was advancing so much throughout the 19th century, but we weren't really in control of it. So that leads to, we were, but in many ways we weren't. So it led to things like when radium was discovered. For a while there, everyone thought that was this magical cure-all elixir, and you got things like radium suppositories that were supposed to help with impotence. Obviously they caused cancer and killed people. But radium face cream that you would put on. Another craze was magnets. For a while people thought that magnets which doesn't sound too mad until I tell you that they were doing things like putting magnets on batteries and putting it inside the cervix. There's like a womb battery. Yeah, there's a patent out there for a womb battery that was supposed to administer a small electrical pulse.
Why?
Why? Yeah, because they had a thing about electricity as well when that was discovered. That was like, oh, this will be really good. I know what we'll do. See what I mean? It's like they come up with something, they've discovered electricity, and instead of going, let's just sit with this for a bit, somebody went, let's put a battery in a womb.
and see what happens. That's what
See what
everyone wants.
happens. That's an amazing idea. And the gland stuff was part of that. Other variations on that was tying ligatures in one of the testicles. So it was like a kind of, what do you call it when you have your tubes tied but you're a guy?
Oh, like a
like
vasectomy.
Vasectomy,
yeah.
thank you. Yeah, so it's like a partial vasectomy. The idea was that would somehow let you absorb more of your vital juices and essences. And there was a real quack doctor called Brinkley in America who didn't have any kind of medical training at all, who tried to do it with goat testicles and ended up killing people. And goats, killed goats too.
Oh my! So it wasn't just monkeys then; it's any kind of animal that's got.
They preferred monkeys, but yeah, goats. I guess because goats have a sort of a long reputation with being a lusty animal. They've got that kind of link to Satan with his cloven hooves. So why wouldn't a goat? I mean, once you're down that particular rabbit hole, why not a goat, right?
Yeah, it's pretty hard to get out then, isn't it?
But
you're committing. You have to really commit. Just keep going.
Keep going, as you may as well by that point. But yeah, I thought that was a very interesting fact that may be where the species jump happened.
Well, I had no idea that you were going to come out with
Happy
a fact
to
like
help.
that. Oh, fantastic! I mean, we could talk to you all day. We really could, and I hope that you'll come back again.
I will,
absolutely, chat with us because we've learned so much. But for now, thank you so much for a very enlightening conversation. Who knew we'd end up here?
Yeah, who knew we'd end up with goat testicles? Like,
yes,
who knew that would happen?
My work
way
is
to
done.
end.
Thanks for listening to the HIV podcast. If you enjoyed our podcast, please like, rate and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts.
You can now also follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the HIV Podcast for behind the scenes insights and video. The HIV Podcast is produced by Thames Valley Positive Support.